Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues here in this House. And I'd particularly like to thank the Liberals, the Bloc, the Conservatives, the NDP. They've decided to give the Green Party of Canada the opportunity to rise and speak in this House, and I'm very grateful. So I'd like to thank all of them very, very much. We have now heard the fall economic statement 2022. It's not a budget. We're looking then. We've had a foretaste of what budget 2023 might look like, and the Minister of Finance has given us a glimpse of the trends that are to come.
Is an honest assessment, more honest than many finance ministers, in saying things aren't going to be great very soon. C'est important d'être honnête. C'est important de faire face à la réalité économique parce que ce n'est pas seulement nous, Canadiens, qui doivent faire face à la réalité des problèmes mondiaux. Nous avons les problèmes mondiaux et c'est la
It's the growth of costs. Everything is costing more and more. But in my opinion, it's not inflation.
Facing now, and I think the Minister of Finance was honest in saying, as was the Department of Finance, we're not looking at economic growth in the next couple quarters. We're looking at a slowdown. And yes, the minister has said we have a good house, we have a good roof. Those are good things, but we are facing unprecedented global challenges. And I think in looking at this statement, I'm going to be as nonpartisan as I can possibly be in saying that we've got some new indications here that suggest a growing awareness of something that I'm going to say probably more boldly or baldly than other politicians will say. So first, let me just go back and say there are some good news pieces to this budget, some less good news, some missed opportunities, I should say. I really would have hoped to see a tax on the windfall profits of enormous oil and gas and other fossil fuel enterprises. They have been clearing in the billions of dollars every quarter what has been described by others, not just certainly the Secretary General of the United Nations. These windfall profits are not due to the economic wisdom, the genius of those in the fossil fuel industry who know how to ready their industry for great success. Let's be clear, this is because of Putin's war in Ukraine. This is war profiteering. No sector, no CEO should be proud to be able to return profits to shareholders because of war profiteering. They should not be proud to do that when they're raking in unprecedented levels of profit and Canadians are suffering. That's something of which no business CEO should be proud. I'm from the Maritimes. I'm friends with the Irving family, so forgive me if I mention the Irvings, who not only are the only refinery in Canada that imports Saudi Arabian oil, have also experienced windfall profits, and it turns out from today's news, figured out a way to avoid paying taxes in Canada through a bit of a shell game with their own insurance company offshore. Well, Canadian corporate leadership needs to be able to look itself in the mirror and say, what are you doing for Canadians? All of you. And I think the Minister of Finance missed the opportunity today to set a course that says, if you're experiencing windfall profits, be you in the fossil fuel sector, banking or insurance, and banking insurance have had some increase, but not sufficient to really deal with the excess profit problem. If you're dealing with a handful of Canadian families who hold a great percentage of Canadians' wealth, shouldn't we be looking at a wealth tax? Because when a government says we see that rough weather is ahead, we see that Canadians are going to be facing increasing costs for many things, Shouldn't we right now be saying we need additional revenue to be able to ensure that those who are suffering the most from this can pay their rent, can cover their mortgages, take their kids to the grocery store and not the food bank? How do we make that possible? Well, it's not from trickle-down economics that the economy is going to do so well in a year or two or three that that's going to lift everybody up. We know that story. The rising tide, they said, will lift all boats. Trickle down will work. Well, we know how it works. The rising tide lifts all yachts. It doesn't lift all boats. And we know that people are going to need help with their own little boats very soon. Another place to have more revenue is to stop spending money on hand over fist handing billions of dollars, particularly to a sector that we know is responsible for us having to spend hand over fist other billions of dollars in the climate crisis. We have promised in this country, since Stephen Harper was Prime Minister in 2009, he was at a G20 summit, I recall.
The honourable member has a point of order.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I'd like to point out that there's no quorum.
Just a moment. I'll just double check on virtual as well. So I really appreciate the honourable member rising on a point of order. We're going to ring the bells to get the quorum into the House. Okay. So we have quorum. So the honourable member, I'd like to call on the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands to continue her speech.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank all my honourable colleagues for their keen interest in ensuring we have quorum. I also particularly want to thank the honourable member for Whitby, who I know had to interrupt a very important meeting on climate finance. I do want to recognise that one of the pieces of this fall economic statement, which will be much improved, is when we move ahead with climate finance reforms. I particularly want to mention from the other place, we eventually, I hope, will be seeing Bill S-243, which will ensure that the financial sector lines up and aligns with climate goals. But back to what I was going to be saying before, Madam Speaker, when we look at the situation in which we find ourselves, Canadians do need help in the short term. The source for that help must be by going after the excess profits of large sectors such as the fossil fuel sector, such as the financial sector, the banking and insurance sectors, and indeed grocery store chains, if it can be established that those are indeed excess profits, as has been alleged so very effectively by colleagues in the New Democratic Party. We do know that there are things that we can do to weather storms by taking care of each other. In looking at this financial update, I think it's very notable. Je pense que c'est la première fois.
I think that this is the first time that I have read something prepared by the Department of Finance, and it's so clear that the climate emergency is not being dealt with the same way as an environmental problem that we should spend on. So, for the first time, this fall economic statement in the government's explanation of problems, crises, challenges which are ongoing, well, it's very clear that the climate crisis isn't one of the crises, it's actually a cause of problems.
It appears in reading this fall economic statement that increasingly Finance Canada recognizes a threat to our economic health and a cause of the instability globally that we face is the climate crisis. references in this fall economic statement, not just for we're going to have a fund that's going to, and I'm pleased to see investment tax credits to more clean tech development. I will flag that small modular reactors should not be on that list, but for solar, for wind, for low flow hydro, for geothermal, and for the technologies that allow us to avoid waste of energy. All of this is really good stuff, but that's not what I'm talking about. Talking about where Finance Canada notes that the disruption of supply chains caused, at least in part, by climate crisis events. Disruption of supply chains like goods can't get to market when the water is so low in the Mississippi River that Canadian bitumen can't reach refineries in the U.S. Interruptions to supply chains created by things like atmospheric rivers that wipe out the roads to the lower mainland of Vancouver. We're still paying. This fall economic statement points to the costs that will continue to be experienced and the need to help Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec. So they've got ongoing costs to help people recover from Hurricane Fiona. We still have billions of dollars from last year's fall economic statement to help British Columbia recover. And in that set of atmospheric river events we had last fall, recall that every single land connection to Vancouver, the largest city in Western Canada, every single land route was disabled for a period of time. That had effect on supply chains. So supply chains are affected by the climate crisis. So too are the large economic events created by the climate crisis. And in real terms, droughts in other countries around the world drive up food prices for what Canadians pay in the stores. So the climate crisis is not a separate environmental issue that requires spending. It's actually becoming and begun to be seen in Finance Canada as a fabric, part of the fabric of the economic situation in which we find ourselves. And I'll go farther. When I said earlier that this is not your classic inflation. This is not your classic demand inflation, demand-driven inflation. Largely, we're experiencing now is supply-driven increase in costs because of, yes, Putin's invasion of Ukraine and climate crisis events, which are in real terms making things cost more. When things really cost more, the tools we have in monetary policy and Bank of Canada raising the rates won't have the same salutary effect. When we were dealing with, as in the early 70s, we had an inflation crisis. Former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau brought in emergency wage and price controls. That's not what we're experiencing now. We have real cost increases because of a real war and because of a climate emergency, and the costs and the prices are uneven all over the map. So when we look at the threats to our economy of the climate emergency, we have to realize we need to do much more. And it's clear from the way this document is prepared that whether it's being said out loud or not yet in Finance Canada, I've never read a document from Finance Canada ever which had so many references to the multiple ways in which the climate crisis is impacting our economy, all of them negative. I look to one point, though, and I think we are ignoring an opportunity that we need to seize. And the Honourable Minister of Finance's introductory remarks point to a moment back in 1903 when former Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier told this House that we cannot wait, that it is the time for action. And he was referring to the challenge to build a transcontinental railway. Well, for the moment, I'll skip over the cost in human lives, the impact in seizing Indigenous lands of building that railway. But let's just say right now we have a similar challenge and we are ignoring it. And that is, how do we link our electric grids together? The essence of a 100% carbon-free, not carbon neutral, carbon-free electricity grid with the electricity moving through it from solar power, and Alberta will be the big winner in solar power. Cheaper electricity can be produced by solar in Alberta than anywhere else in the country. Our existing hydro in BC, I wish to goodness we weren't talking about Site C, but we can do much, much more with renewable energy across Canada. And the storage system that we mostly need is that our grid should work. Grid should work east, west, and north, south. We're not talking about that in this fall economic statement. We're not really addressing it anywhere because we run up against the perennial problem of federation. We can't ship beer across Canada, and we can't ship electricity. We can't get electricity from Manitoba Hydro across from eastern Manitoba to western Ontario, so we don't have interties. And that area, I happen to know well, is important boreal forest. We should have interties, but that's Indigenous land. If we honor UNDRIP, which we must, it requires free prior informed consent before we even start drawing lines on the map for the electricity grid. We know that there are private sector entrepreneurs already who see the way that they can get electricity from Hydro-Quebec to Nunavut. We have to think big, and we have to recognize that just as in 1903 the challenge was building a trans-Canadian railway, we need, as a modern industrialized country, to have a trans-Canadian electricity grid, because the grid is the battery. I just, for one moment, Madam Speaker, give the one short example. In Europe, with separate nation states within the European Union, they actually coordinate and work better together than our provinces and territories work with the federal government. It's appalling, but true. Denmark produces so much excess wind energy that Denmark sells its excess wind energy to Norway. Norway buys the cheap and green wind energy from Denmark, and if it doesn't need it that day, it pumps it up into existing reservoirs. This is called pump storage. It's one of the technologies mentioned here. And it stays there till Norway needs it. Then they open up the sluices, the water follows gravity, drives the turbines, and then when the cheap wind energy comes over from Denmark, they pump it back up. It's elegant, it's simple, it's international exchange of electricity that we cannot do in Canada because we don't have the interties, and it's a big project. And it needs to be mentioned, and it needs to be thought through. Lastly, I'll just close on these points, Madam Speaker. This increase in costs that Canadians are feeling is not our normal inflation. It is not demand-driven. It is not that either, I say to my honourable friend from Kingston, the Islands. I can hear him, and I'm not going to say that out loud because I know it's prohibited in this House. This is not normal inflation in the sense that it is not demand-driven primarily. It is partly. It is largely being driven by a war in Ukraine, which we must, and I did want to mention this, Canadians, we support Ukraine. We believe that President Zelenskyy and his bravery and that of the Ukrainian people must be reflected in our solidarity with them. But in that solidarity, we must do much, much more to achieve a peace, to push for, and this is relevant to the fall economic statement because so much of the increased prices we're experiencing here are because of Putin's brutal, illegal, immoral war on Ukraine. We must use every lever as a soft power to push for peace talks, to push for ceasefires. It's not good enough to say, we stand with Ukraine, Slava Ukraine. We have to do more for peace because we're a country that can do that. And we may have to say to our NATO allies, if belonging to NATO means we really can't help Ukraine, maybe we don't belong in NATO. If NATO can't work for peace and NATO can't work for nuclear disarmament, maybe it's time to ask our NATO allies, what's the good of an alliance that can't protect Ukraine because of nuclear weapons inside NATO and inside Russia that threaten us all? But we have to face the real costs that are going up. We have to face multiple crises at the same time To avoid a global food crisis, to avoid a global water crisis, we must do more in this country as global leaders on climate change. And that means stopping the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, converting that Crown Corporation to other uses that are actually beneficial for Canadians, such as building resiliency across this country, building the infrastructure we need. We do not need the Trans Mountain expansion. It is, in the words of Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations, it represents moral and economic madness. So too does expanding to drilling off the coast of Newfoundland and Bay du Nord. So too does continuing fracking across Canada while pretending that Canadian liquefied natural gas is somehow better than coal. On doit faire face à toutes ces réalités.
We need to face this reality. We need to face this economic reality. We also need to address the reality of this ongoing war and the ongoing climate crisis.
The worst of climate change by changing course quickly. We can follow the indicators that the Minister of Finance has given us in this budget and say by spring 2023, let the budget stand for Canada laying down the markers that we move, according to the science, to move off fossil fuels, protect the workers in that sector, and make sure that Canadians are in a house that can stand the coming storms. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Then comments, the honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my friend from Saanich Gulf Islands. Before the pandemic, one of our big concerns was the gig economy, and a lot of people looking at 2 or maybe even 3 very low-paying jobs to make a go of it. Now, that sector seems to be short of people, as the people who used to be in the gig economy move up to take the place of guys my age who've retired. Some of us haven't got the memo yet, but still, we have a lot of older Canadians now who backed out of the labor market. So we have an immigration plan that will bring more people into the country to fill those jobs. But I wonder if the honourable member could reflect on whether or not we should make an extra effort to avoid a new class, a new generation of low-paid gig workers in Canada.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my honourable colleague for a great question. We are also facing, and the Canadian Labour Congress published a piece on it a couple of years ago, the new world of work. What does our economy look like for workers when we look at artificial intelligence? So we have a gig economy that's already made many people insecure in the jobs they've got. I completely agree with my honourable friend that we are seeing, as people retire, we have a demographic bubble of boomers who are leaving the workforce, and we don't have enough people coming up behind us. That's why we're looking in this fall economic statement at increases in immigration and hoping that those people are trained professionals, workforce, construction workers particularly are mentioned in the statement. But we could do far more to prepare for artificial intelligence by moving to guaranteed livable income as quickly as possible to protect our economy from the coming shocks. And then people can choose, knowing that they have just enough income to be above the poverty line, to maybe work a bit in the gig economy, maybe have a garden at home, maybe spend more time in community volunteering, but we'll be a healthier society and better able to withstand any shocks that are coming once we adopt a guaranteed livable income.
Questions and comments? L'honorable secrétaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister and to the President of the Treasury Board. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Whenever I listen to the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands speak, I learn a lot. I wish to thank her for her excellent speech and analysis of the fall economic statement. Madam Speaker, here's my question. The Honourable Member mentioned that this inflation is not typical. It's not what it usually is. The Finance Minister and her department did acknowledge that. Now, I have a very honest question to ask of my colleague. I often listen to my colleagues speak, and we all know that even if we were to stop all economic activity, there is a lag between our activities and greenhouse gas emissions. So there will be modifications and there will be changes to our climate, regardless of what we do now. Is she also telling us that from here on in, there will always be inflationary pressures due to climate change, which will last for a long time? The Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands. I thank my colleague from Hell Aylmer for his very good question. We are currently in a period which is not short. This is the title of a book.
Chancellor, about a decade ago, called The Long Emergency, which predicted that we were going to see our economy significantly rocked by what will happen as fossil fuels become more expensive, as we move away from fossil fuels. And the long emergency was about where we are now. Real costs increasing, a real dislocation. Now, that doesn't mean ongoing inflationary trends. It does mean thinking about how a society flourishes despite these very unusual headwinds. They're unusual now because they're new, but they're not going away. So we have to think about that and make sure that we design our economy and our economic signals of what makes us better off. The GDP is not a good set of measurements to help us chart a course through ongoing climate emergency. We need to chart our course, and I think this is a global challenge that just as at the end of the Second World War, nations met at Bretton Woods to figure out what are the global and shared financial institutions that help us get through this. We need new institutions and a review, a new Bretton Woods, if you will, that will help both the post-COVID impacts on our economies, the current climate impacts on our economies, and we can't rewrite the laws of atmospheric physics and chemistry. We can easily rewrite the way we want our economy to work if all the economies and central banks of the world get together and say, all right, this is what we're looking at. How do we protect the citizens and the communities of all, and I would hope, the non-human species of Mother Earth?
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In a previous question, the member for Saanich Gulf Islands spoke about a guaranteed basic income. In this House, there is legislation put forward, it's Bill C-22, that would provide that for Canadians with disabilities who are living in legislated poverty. However, in this fall economic statement, we didn't see anything with respect to funding the benefit, nor did we see anything with respect to emergency supports, like was done with CERB, to address the conditions of those living in poverty and those living with disabilities across the country. Can she speak more about this opportunity that, if it's not in this fall economic statement, how all parliamentarians can work together to continue to advocate to ensure that, if not now, then perhaps by budget 2023, that these critical supports are put into place?
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And I thank my honourable colleague from Kitchener Centre. This is one of the big disappointments in the budget, in the fall economic statement, I must say, is that with work being done on C-22 in this place, with the unanimous support that C-22 received at second reading, I would have hoped we'd see something of an emergency short-term fund to ensure that no Canadian in the disability community is living below the poverty line, and we know that all too often people living with disabilities are in fact disproportionately part of the community of the lowest income Canadians. So yes, I think we need an emergency short-term support. We don't have to wait for the next budget. It could be brought forward anytime. We know we're going to see a Budget Implementation Act at some point. A Budget Implementation Act would be a good place to see an emergency short-term payment for people living with disabilities until C-22 can come through and be fully funded and fully enacted.
Time for a brief question. Bref question. The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to follow up another item that is mentioned in words in the Fall Economic Statement, but not so much in actions, is addressing the housing crisis that we find ourselves in. And so it's in the preamble, but then when it comes to actual measures, there's only one mention of moving forward on a flipping measure to assignment sales for homes, but nothing when it comes to, for example, ensuring homes should be places for people to live and not simply a commodity for investors to trade. Can she comment on measures and what she might have wanted to see that would have more directly addressed not just the rhetoric that we need, but the measures to address the housing crisis?
Brief message, brief response. There's 30 seconds left.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks, my honourable colleague from Kitchener Centre. Is that the minister's speech talked about, quote, tackling housing speculation, but the flipping piece that's the only measure in here was already announced. We need to do much more. I would recommend with the 10 seconds I have left probably, we need to address how much of our homes and housing has been taken out of access for people to live in dwellings and has become part of an Airbnb market that is global, unaccountable, and pays very little taxes in Canada.